This week's conversation emanates from the book of Ruth. We've just finished up Judges. Judges is the detailing of the generations of Israel in this period before the monarchy starts and after the generation Joshua brought into the promised land. It only took one generation for the people to fall away from obedience to God and worship and accept all of the gods of the area that they settled in, and they lost focus relatively quick. The period of the Judges is about 400 years, and even several places in the book of Judges, it says this was the time where people did whatever they wanted. They didn't live by moral codes or rules, or any of those things kind of fell by the wayside. But then we get this book of Ruth right after it. And Ruth actually takes place in the time of the Judges. It was also written after it took place. Just as Judges was written, Ruth was also written during the monarchy times, and the times from the prophet Samuel into the monarchy. So it was written as looking back. It's a wonderful piece of literature, and people marvel over the perfection of the actual literary words. The introduction of Ruth has 71 Hebrew words, and the conclusion of Ruth concludes with 71 Hebrew words. So there's this perfect balance, and it's all about the ideas of hope, the whole idea of being empty and being full, being empty and being full. And it gives us hope because we can see through the story that even though the society at the time was far from God, there were still a few people, a remnant, that were loyal and obedient, and God saw them, and God protected them, and God used them to bring forth the future of the birth line. In Ruth, even at the end, we see that Ruth is actually King David's great-great-grandmother. And so that means she ultimately becomes a great to the something grandmother of Jesus. And we also see that Ruth is not an Israelite, she's a Moabite. There are lots of things you can see in the book of Ruth happening. There are some comparisons being made. In the beginning, we have Ruth and we have Orpah, the two daughter-in-laws. Both were nice, both were wanting to do right by their mother-in-law, and Orpah didn't really do anything wrong by going off and following what Naomi told her to do, to go back to her people. But Ruth, she just stayed loyal. She had this different quality. She wanted to serve her mother-in-law was more important than her future as a wife and a mother. And then we see near the end of the story, you see we have Boaz, and then we have this other kinsman redeemer, who ends up passing on being the redeemer because he has no interest in taking a Moabite woman and providing for her and her mother-in-law. And so he's just like, no, I don't need to do anything like that. And that's contrasted with Boaz, who, remember, this was a period of time where people did whatever they wanted. And Boaz is following the Hebrew law. He's not doing whatever he feels like. He's saying, wait a minute, there is, according to the law, I have to make sure the other kinsman that's closer relation does not want to fulfill this obligation. And so he goes above and beyond. In Judges, we talked about the cycle, the sin cycle, the cycle that the people kept going through. They were disobedient and they sinned. God let them be overcome by enemies. He didn't punish them, but he stepped out of the way and said, okay, do it on your own. The people cry out in their suffering God hears them, forgives them, and he ultimately provides salvation. This cycle is repeated all through Judges, and it tells the story of how salvation is going to come in the future. And at this time, they're focused on salvation coming to Israel through their king, and it's going to be through King David, as is seen as where the salvation for Israel will come from. And it's saying also that the thing that's going to break this cycle of suffering, supplication, and then salvation, what's going to break that cycle is the throne and having King David on the throne. But that really is just foreshadowing, because what ultimately breaks that cycle is Jesus Christ on the throne. And so if you want to break that cycle in your own life, that cycle of sin and realizing you fall into sin and begging God's forgiveness, and if you want to have that in your own personal life, the remedy to that is keeping Jesus Christ on the throne of your life. And that's all different messages like that can be seen through Ruth. You can take a lot of things out of the book. Some of the things I really love about the book of Ruth is it really helps also portray an egalitarian view of what God's kingdom was meant to be. Women were just as valuable as men in God's kingdom. Even from the beginning, we have seen that women are equally valuable and play equally as important, vital roles in the kingdom. Ruth and her nobility, her virtue, her worthiness ends up being the channel through which Jesus Christ comes to earth. And I'll close out this short little discussion about Ruth with some reading. And the reading that I've chose is Proverbs 31, and I'm going to start at verse 10. Proverbs 31 is often used. It describes like what the perfect woman, what the perfect wife would be, and what her characteristics would be. And the words, many of the words used in Proverbs 31 are the exact same words used to describe Ruth. And so it's just interesting, that correlation between the two instances. And let me start with reading just what Boaz says about Ruth. And he says in 3:11, "And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So you can see that Boaz is seeing the loyalty, the genuineness, the nobility of Ruth's character. And in Proverbs 31, you see some of the same exact characteristics. A wife of noble character, who can find? She is worth more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She selects wool and flax and works with eager hands. She is like the merchant ships bringing her food from afar. She gets up while it is a still night and provides food for her family and portions for her female servants. It goes on and on to describe. Looking at the different versions, it's just very interesting that some versions use nobility, virtuous, worthy, excellent. These are all words that are used to describe Ruth and describe the excellent wife. And it's just very interesting to me when you read this um, in Proverbs, you can hear the story of Ruth in in that in that portrayal. So I find it very interesting for me. Anyway, so Ruth is great. Give it a read. Give your soul refreshing. Give yourself hope, um, and know that you are seen. If you haven't had the chance, I said Ruth is just 4 chapters. It's very short. And read it in the context of knowing that it's taking place in this period of time where society is at an all-time low. People do whatever they want, follow their own rules, follow any kind of theology that makes them happy. They are all in it for their own benefit, what makes them feel good. And so look at that context and then read the story of Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz, and see that even in the midst of a society like that, God sees you. God saw them. God saw Naomi's emptiness and brought her fulfillment. Not because she wanted it, but because she was loyal and faithful and obedient. And there's just some hope there that God sees us. God sees you in the midst of all the chaos and craziness that goes on around. And his plan is still working itself out. And the righteous and those that follow him are still being led into his plan.